My husband said running the house was the bare minimum a Roomba could handle. So I got a job and left him to do everything until he accidentally sent our daughter to school with his mom's prescription narcotics instead of her lunch. Got us investigated by child services. She became known as the substance girl, and he nearly lost both his job and our kids because he couldn't even remember to pay the electric bill. My husband Darren has always insisted that me taking care of the entire household was the bare minimum. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, helping with homework, packing school lunches, driving to practice, making beds, grocery shopping, literally everything besides his job was, in his words, a breeze. He'd walk in the door at 5, plant himself on the couch, and by 6 he'd be drinking a beer in front of the TV, while I hadn't stopped moving since dawn and wouldn't until bedtime. Thing is, it never really bothered me until I started noticing what Darren actually thought of me. It started as tiny comments at dinner I used to shrug off, like when our daughter Clara mentioned her friend's mom, who's a surgeon, and Darren said, "Now that's a real career," while looking right at me. Or how at his company events, when someone asked what I did, he'd always say, "She's just a housewife." The more I thought about it, the more it burned. He'd walk by while I was scrubbing toilets and toss out a sarcastic, "rough life." At parent-teacher conferences, he'd cut me off to translate what the teacher was saying, like I couldn't understand basic English. When the washing machine broke and I fixed it with the YouTube tutorial, he told his friends I got lucky pressing buttons. He'd FaceTime his mom while I was cooking and swing the camera over to me saying, "Look, Mom, Tara's pretending to be busy again." I organized our taxes, receipts, and bills every year, and he'd crack that even monkeys could sort paper. When our neighbors noticed how run down I looked and gently suggested I might need help, Darren laughed and said getting a maid would be pointless since Tara barely did anything a Roomba couldn't manage. The more I replayed it all in my head, the angrier I got. Then, one night at a family dinner, I snapped. Darren's brother was visiting and Darren was hoarding court, bragging about his latest promotion, which I was actually happy about, by the way. His brother turned to me and asked what I'd been up to. I lit up. Nobody ever asked me that. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, Darren cut in with, "Oh, you know Tara, she doesn't do a whole lot. Choosing between paper and plastic straws is probably her biggest decision all day." Everyone laughed. Even our kids laughed. I sat there silently cutting my chicken and I felt something shift inside of me. That night, I dusted off my resume for the first time in 15 years. I'd been a marketing director before Clara was born, but Darren had insisted one of us should stay home. Well, I applied to 5 jobs, and not long after, I got an offer from a tech startup. The salary was 15 grand less than Darren's, but I took it immediately. The Sunday night before my first day, I made a nice dinner, pot roast, Darren's favorite. As we ate, I casually mentioned that I'd gotten a job and would be starting in the morning. Darren laughed like I was joking. "Right," he said. "Doing what, exactly?" I explained the marketing position, and I watched the amusement drain from his face. The kids looked confused, like the idea of Mom working outside the house didn't compute. "You can't be serious, Tara. Who's going to handle everything here? The kids have practice, Clara's recital is coming up, my mom needs her prescriptions." "I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said, taking another bite of pot roast. Next morning, I left at 7 sharp. Darren was fumbling with the coffee maker. Clara was yelling that she didn't have clean volleyball shorts. Leo couldn't find his science textbook. I grabbed my purse and travel mug and walked out the door. That first week was incredible. I'd forgotten how good it felt to use my brain for something other than managing a household. My coworkers treated me like an actual person, with ideas that mattered. Meanwhile, my phone was lighting up with chaos. Darren missed an important meeting because he had to pick up Leo from school. Clara wore dirty gym clothes. They ate takeout 4 nights in a row. By the second week, Darren was begging me to quit. "This isn't working, Tara." The house was a disaster. "I can't manage my job and all this other stuff," Darren said. "Other stuff?" I asked. "You mean the bare minimum?" By the end of month 1, Darren had gained 15 pounds from eating fast food every day, and his boss had pulled him aside to talk about his sudden drop in performance. The kids were constantly complaining. Clara missed her recital because Darren forgot to put it in his calendar. Leo failed a test. No one had helped him study. By month 3, Darren's life was a full-blown wreck. His brother came for Thanksgiving and was stunned by the state of the house. Dishes piled high, laundry covering the floors. Darren looked worn out, dark circles under his eyes, shoulders slumped. His brother actually muttered, "Dude, what happened to Mr. I Make the Money?" I had to hide my smile behind my wine glass. Month 4 brought the breaking point. Darren's company announced a round of layoffs. He called me from his car, crying, "Tara, I can't lose this job. Not now. Not when I can barely function. Please, I'm sorry. I had no idea what you did. I'm drowning here." I agreed to help him through the layoff scare, but I made it clear things were going to be different. He needed to start pulling his weight around the house. He agreed before I could even finish the sentence. 1 week later, I got promoted. Honestly, things started to run pretty smoothly, at work and at home. But then, while I was deep into a report, someone knocked on my office door. "Your husband called 6 times about an emergency at your daughter's school," my assistant said. I checked my phone. 34 missed calls, 15 from the school, 1 voicemail from the police. Darren's last text read, "Tara, please call me back. I think I really messed up, like legal trouble messed up." My assistant added, "Also, there's a woman here who says she's your mother-in-law's attorney." My heart pounded as I grabbed my bag and rushed out of the office, fumbling with my keys the entire way. The drive to Clara's school felt endless, even though I made it in just under 12 minutes. Police cruisers lined the parking lot, lights flashing red and blue against the brick exterior. Worried parents clustered by the entrance, murmuring. Darren stood outside the principal's office, pale and sweating. The moment he saw me, he grabbed my arm with shaking hands and pulled me aside. The principal stepped out, expression unreadable, and gestured for us to come in. The small office felt claustrophobic, with Darren, me, the principal, and 2 uniformed police officers packed inside. One of them held up a sealed evidence bag. Inside were several prescription bottles. Darren shifted in his seat, his leg bouncing uncontrollably. The principal explained Darren had picked up his mother's prescriptions that morning and left the bag in the back seat. When he dropped Clara off, late, she'd grabbed the bag thinking it was her lunch. Instead, she carried a sack full of controlled substances into school. The situation escalated when Clara noticed the bottles, confused by her lunch, and showed them to her teacher. The teacher contacted the office immediately. The school went into lockdown. Police were called. Drug-sniffing dogs swept the premises. I watched Darren slowly collapse in on himself as the officers explained the seriousness of what happened. They used words like endangerment, negligence, and investigation. My stomach twisted. The principal told us Clara had been deeply shaken. She was pulled from class, questioned by police in front of everyone, and was now sitting in the nurse's office in tears. Other parents were demanding answers. The school board would be convening to discuss next steps. After nearly an hour of questioning and forms, the officers said they wouldn't be arresting Darren for now, but the incident would be thoroughly investigated. We'd have to attend meetings with Child Protective Services. Clara might face suspension, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. I found her in the nurse's office, curled up on the cot, her face blotchy and eyes swollen. She wouldn't even look at Darren. On the way home, she sat in the back seat, arms crossed, staring out the window. Darren tried to apologize. She just turned up the volume on her headphones. When we got home, Leo was already there. He'd walked back from his school. News spread fast around here. He gave Darren a look I won't forget, part fury, part disappointment. Apparently, the kids were already texting about Clara. She'd become the substance girl. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Other parents demanding to know what had happened. My boss asking if I'd be back in the office that day. The school counselor was scheduling mandatory sessions. Darren's mother kept calling, confused as to why her prescriptions were now sitting at a police station. Darren paced the living room, running his hands through his hair, muttering that this wasn't his fault, that anyone could have made the same mistake. But I noticed he couldn't look me in the eye. The doorbell rang. Darren's mother stood there, flanked by a woman in a sharp blazer. The woman introduced herself as an attorney hired to help us navigate the situation. She launched straight into questions about the school's policies and whether we had grounds to contest any disciplinary action. I excused myself to check on the kids. Clara had locked herself in her room. Through the door, I heard her on the phone with friends, her voice cracking as she tried to explain what had happened, insisting she hadn't known what was in the bag. Leo sat at the kitchen table, books and homework spread in front of him, though none of it had been touched. He looked up when I walked in, his face unusually serious. "Are you and Dad getting divorced?" he asked. The question hit me harder than I expected. When I returned, the lawyer was laying out potential consequences. The school might pursue expulsion. CPS would certainly investigate. Depending on the outcome, Darren could face criminal charges. Our entire family would be under a microscope for months. Somehow, Darren had gone from "Tara barely does anything a Roomba couldn't handle" to turning our daughter into the school's most infamous lunch bearer in record time. His mother kept saying it was a misunderstanding, that Darren was a good father, but I caught the way she looked at him when no one else was watching. Disappointed. She'd warned him before about being careless with her medications, more than once. The lawyer left with a retainer check and a promise to reach out to the school board. Darren's mother followed shortly after. But before she left, she pulled me aside. She whispered that she'd been telling Darren for months he needed to get it together. She'd seen how overwhelmed he was. That evening, no one felt like eating. Clara stayed locked in her room. Leo grabbed a sandwich and disappeared to his room to play video games. Darren sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, frantically researching legal precedents for accidental possession of controlled substances on school grounds. I tried to read through my work emails, but I couldn't concentrate. My recent promotion felt like it belonged to another life. Everything I'd worked so hard to build, our stability, our routine, our progress, was suddenly crumbling because of one careless, avoidable mistake. The school called again. The emergency board meeting had been scheduled for the next morning. We'd be expected to show up and explain ourselves. Other parents were demanding Clara be removed from all extracurricular activities until the investigation concluded. Her volleyball season might already be over. Around 10 that night, Darren finally broke. He sat on the couch with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking. He admitted he'd been so determined to prove he could do it all that he started cutting corners, leaving things in the car, forgetting appointments, making careless, dangerous errors. But the apology felt shallow. The damage was already done. Clara's reputation was in tatters. Our family was under scrutiny. My new job, the one that had finally made me feel like myself again, now came with the shadow of being that woman whose kid brought drugs to school. I stayed up most of the night making lists. Lawyers to call, documents to gather, people who might write character references. The irony wasn't lost on me. Once again, I was the one picking up the pieces, managing a crisis Darren created because he couldn't handle the bare minimum. By morning, I had a plan. We'd fight the school's disciplinary action. We'd cooperate fully with child services. Clara would start counseling to help her process what she'd been through. But things had to change permanently. Darren's season of trying his best was over. If we needed professional help, systems, charts, outside support, we'd get it. The emergency board meeting was set for 8 a.m. I dressed with care, professionally but calmly. Darren wore his best suit, but it hung loose. He'd lost weight from stress and missed meals. Clara refused to come, so we arranged for her to stay with my sister. The meeting room was packed. Other parents filled the chairs, their expressions a blend of concern and judgment. I recognized many of them from PTA meetings I'd helped run, where I'd coordinated bake sales, book drives, and field trips. Now they looked at us like we were dangerous strangers. The board president called the meeting to order. What followed was an hour of tense, heated discussion about school safety, zero-tolerance policies, and the kind of message this incident would send to the other students. Parents stood up one after another, voicing fears and demanding immediate action. Darren tried to speak, his voice unsteady as he described the chaos of that morning, his mother's medical needs, the honest mistake, but his words fell flat against a wall of outrage. Someone suggested calling the local news stations. Another floated a petition to bar our family from the school grounds entirely. Finally, I stood. My voice was calm, unwavering. I reminded everyone of the years I'd spent volunteering, organizing fundraisers, hosting classroom events, supporting their children. I asked them to consider the trauma already inflicted on a child who had done nothing wrong but pick up the wrong bag. The room went quiet. A few parents shifted uncomfortably, recalling the times I'd helped their families or supported their causes. But the damage was done. Even if Clara stayed enrolled, her name would carry a shadow. Kids could be cruel, but parents, sometimes worse. After the meeting, we sat in the car in silence. Darren stared at the steering wheel, shoulders sagging. I thought about all those dinners where he downplayed my work, all the times he'd said I was doing the bare minimum, and now he hadn't even managed that without plunging our family into chaos. My phone buzzed, a message from my boss. She was kind but concerned. She mentioned how family situations like this could bleed into professional life, how they could affect performance. That promotion I'd worked so hard for suddenly felt fragile, like it could vanish with one more headline. And speaking of headlines, when we got home, there were reporters from the local paper parked outside. Someone from the meeting must have tipped them off. Substance scare at local elementary was sure to make a click-worthy title. Darren bolted inside. I politely declined to comment. Inside, Leo was sitting on the couch eating dry cereal from the box while playing video games. He'd skipped school, too embarrassed to face the flood of questions about Clara. The house felt like a bunker. We were all hiding, from the media, from the neighbors, and from each other. I realized then how completely Darren's inability to manage basic responsibilities had caused a chain reaction. One forgotten bag of prescriptions, and now everything was unraveling. My job, our kids' emotional well-being, our reputation, all dangling by a thread because Darren couldn't keep track of one essential task. The lawyer called with updates. The police investigation would take weeks. Child Services would begin home visits soon. The school board would vote on disciplinary action next month. Until then, Clara would be allowed in class, but under a safety plan that felt more like a warning label than support. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, tracing every moment that led us here. From Darren's casual mockery of my work to this full-blown crisis sparked by his incompetence. The man who used to say household management was beneath him had proven he couldn't even do it safely. The next morning brought more fallout. Clara's volleyball coach called to say she'd been benched until the investigation was resolved. Her grades were plummeting from stress. Leo had started acting out, getting into arguments with teachers. Our family was cracking under the pressure of Darren's mistake. I dove into damage control. My days became a rotation of legal meetings, school conferences, and therapy appointments. My boss thankfully gave me flexibility, but I knew it wouldn't last forever. The career milestone I just achieved was now slipping through my fingers as I fought to keep our home from collapsing. Meanwhile, Darren seemed frozen. He went through the motions at work, then came home and sat in stunned silence most nights. He'd finally begun to see the housework he once mocked as a mountain he couldn't climb. The confident man who used to roll his eyes at my easy days was now undone by grocery lists and dirty socks. 3 weeks into the chaos, Child Services arrived for their first home visit. They combed through every room, asked pointed questions, and took notes on their tablets. Each child was interviewed separately. Clara cried during hers. Leo shut down, angry and cold. Darren stumbled through his explanations. Their report would determine whether our family stayed intact. The weight of that fact hovered over every conversation, every glance. Even the simplest exchanges had become tense, measured, strategic. Family dinners had become silent rituals. Each of us sat there, lost in our own dread about what might come next. I found myself slipping back into what I'd always done, managing everything. But this time, it wasn't about proving my value or earning respect. It was about survival. Keeping our family from completely falling apart because Darren had failed to handle even the simplest responsibilities he once brushed off as trivial. The irony was almost too much to bear. After all those years of hearing him call my work the bare minimum, here we were. He couldn't even clear that bar without endangering our children and destroying our name in the community. The man who once claimed I did nothing had shown in full color that doing it all required skills he simply didn't have. As another sleepless night bled into dawn, I wondered if we would ever truly recover. The investigation would eventually wrap up, sure, but the damage, that might be permanent. Trust, once broken, is a fragile thing to rebuild. And Darren hadn't just broken trust. He'd cracked the very foundation of our children's sense of safety. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more spin, more attempts to glue back together the wreckage Darren's carelessness had caused. The bare minimum had never felt so impossibly hard. The next morning, after a night of tossing and turning, I woke to find Darren already gone. A sticky note clung to the coffee maker. Left early, meeting with my boss re performance issues. I got the kids ready in silence. Clara barely touched her cereal. Leo kept his headphones on the whole time, not saying a word. At work, my team had finalized preparations for our quarterly presentation to the board. I'd led this project for weeks. It was the capstone of everything I'd achieved since my promotion. As I went through my final notes, my assistant knocked, wide-eyed. "Darren's here. He says it's urgent, something about a family emergency." I found him pacing near the security desk, his shirt wrinkled, hair a mess. The moment he saw me, he grabbed my shoulders and launched into a rushed explanation. Child Services had just called. They'd received an anonymous tip about neglect and were demanding an immediate home inspection within the hour. My presentation was in 30 minutes. My boss came around the corner, clearly having caught wind of the commotion. Her eyes darted between Darren and me. I gave her the short version, watching her expression shift from empathy to something closer to concern. She reminded me that the board presentation couldn't be rescheduled. Our entire quarterly strategy hinged on it. But Darren insisted I had to come. The investigator had specifically requested both parents be present. Honestly, his knack for perfect timing was almost impressive. Nothing screams "I support your career" like yanking your wife out of a major presentation to fix a disaster you created. He kept checking his phone, showing me missed calls from an unknown number. His hands were shaking. I made a decision that felt like an impossible trade-off. I handed my notes to my assistant and quickly walked her through the key points. She looked panicked, but nodded. Then I turned and followed Darren out the door, the sound of my heels clicking on the pavement loud against the morning quiet. The drive home revealed even more bad news. Darren admitted he'd forgotten to pay the electric bill. Power had been shut off that morning, and he'd been scrambling to get it restored before the inspection. The house was not only powerless, it was still a wreck from the weeks of ongoing chaos. When we pulled up, the Child Services investigator was already there. She stood on our porch, clipboard in hand, glancing at her watch. Darren fumbled with the keys while I mentally reviewed the disaster waiting for us inside. The woman introduced herself as Miss McDaniel. Her tone was flat and professional as she explained the nature of the complaint. Someone had reported that our kids were living in filth, that they were coming to school dirty and hungry. She needed to verify their living conditions, immediately. Inside, the house told its own story. Dirty dishes overflowed in the sink. Piles of laundry had claimed every corner. The fridge, without power, had begun to emit a sour smell. Trash bags lined the hallway where Darren had apparently started to clean, then abandoned the effort. Miss McDaniel took photos of everything. Darren tried to explain the power outage, how it was a mistake, just a missed bill, not actual neglect. But standing there in the dim, musty kitchen, his words felt flimsy, weak, too little, too late. I watched Darren spiral, his excuses only digging the hole deeper. So I stepped in. I guided Ms. McDaniel through the kids' rooms, which, thankfully, I'd managed to keep relatively clean despite the chaos. I handed over medical records, school reports, anything that could prove we were caring for our children. She took notes silently, her expression unreadable. The inspection lasted 2 full hours. She examined everything from pantry contents to the condition of the kids' clothing. She asked detailed questions about our daily routines, work schedules, childcare arrangements. Darren kept interrupting with defensive comments that only made us look more disorganized and negligent. Meanwhile, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from my assistant about the board presentation disaster, my boss asking where I was, teammates checking in wondering if I was okay. Each ping was a reminder that my career, the one thing I'd finally reclaimed, was slipping away. After Ms. McDaniel left with a neutral goodbye and a promise to follow up within 48 hours, Darren collapsed onto the couch, defeated. And then, like clockwork, he turned it on me, blaming me for not being home to manage things, for putting my job before the family. The irony wasn't just painful, it was insulting. After years of dismissing everything I did at home as bare minimum, now he wanted to accuse me of neglect because he couldn't manage any of it? I didn't have time to argue. I spent the rest of the afternoon in full-blown crisis mode. First, I paid the overdue power bill, including a steep reconnection fee. Then I started tackling the house, methodically, one disaster zone at a time. Darren sat at the kitchen table, helping by shifting junk from one pile to another. Around 3, the school called. Clara had broken down in class, sobbing uncontrollably. The counselor suggested she might benefit from coming home early. I left Darren with a to-do list and drove to the school. I found Clara curled up in the nurse's office, eyes puffy, arms wrapped around herself. On the drive home, she finally talked. The kids were calling her names, saying her family was garbage. Rumors were flying that her dad was a drug dealer, that child services was going to take her away. She begged me to homeschool her, to let her disappear until everyone forgot. Back at home, I walked in to hear Darren on the phone with his mother. He was asking her to write a character reference for the investigation. From his side of the conversation, I learned she'd been gossiping about our situation. Her whole social circle apparently knew. That evening, while making dinner under the flicker of newly restored lights, I discovered more fallout. Bills hidden in drawers, unopened. Permission slips for school events, unsigned. A note from Leo's teacher about several missing assignments. The bare minimum Darren used to mock had turned into a mountain and he was buried under it. During dinner, my phone rang again. It was my boss. The board presentation had been a disaster. My assistant had tried her best, but without my experience and insights, key questions had gone unanswered. The quarterly strategy, the one I'd worked so hard to build, was on the verge of collapse. She needed me in early the next day for damage control. Darren overheard the call and immediately started planning my time for me. Suggested I take sick days, maybe even go part-time, just until things calmed down. He still couldn't see how his failure to manage even basic tasks was actively destroying everything I'd spent years rebuilding. The next morning brought more chaos. Leo refused to go to school, claiming his stomach hurt. Clara moved like a shadow, barely speaking. Darren had an important client meeting he couldn't miss. I stood in the kitchen, pulled in every direction, watching my carefully rebuilt life fall apart piece by piece. I made another impossible choice. I called my sister to come stay with Leo. I drove Clara to school myself, walked her to class, made sure she went inside. Then I raced to the office, late again, only to find my team already in panic mode, trying to salvage the quarterly numbers. The day blurred, endless spreadsheets, rushed catch-ups, and a flood of worried texts from home. My sister texted that Leo had spent the morning crying. Clara's teacher emailed, concerned about her disengagement. Darren sent message after message, panicked voicemails about child services calling again. During lunch, I sat alone in my car and called Ms. McDaniel. She explained that they'd received additional complaints. Someone had reported seeing our children walking to school in dirty clothes, unaccompanied. The investigation was escalating. I sat there, stunned. Who would keep reporting us? The timing, the specificity. It felt targeted. Then I remembered Darren mentioning some neighbors who'd gone cold lately. Was this what we'd become now? Neighborhood gossip? Their entertainment? That afternoon, my boss called me into her office. She expressed sympathy for my situation, but reminded me that my performance had taken a hit. The promotion I'd earned was contingent on maintaining high standards. if I couldn't manage my responsibilities, they'd need to reconsider. I left work early, again, and came home to find Darren surrounded by cleaning supplies, but with nothing actually done. He'd spent the day obsessively reading about child services procedures online, convincing himself we were going to lose custody of the kids. His panic was only making things worse. The house phone rang. It was Darren's mother. She informed us that she'd hired a family advocate to assist with the investigation. Then, almost offhandedly, she mentioned she'd been documenting everything for months. Every time Darren had called her for help, every mishap he'd caused. She had it all in writing. Missed school pickups, forgotten appointments, the kids calling her in tears because their dad had forgotten dinner. She said she thought she was helping, but now it read like a case file against us. That evening, I started building my own defense. I pulled receipts proving I'd managed the household finances, school records from when I was the primary caregiver, character references from teachers who'd known me for years. Creating a defense from my own parenting felt surreal. Around 8 p.m., Clara finally came out of her room and asked if we were going to lose our house. Her question gutted me. I told her no, we weren't, but my voice faltered. Between the investigation, legal fees, and my precarious job situation, our financial security was slipping through our fingers. At midnight, Darren found me sorting through stacks of paperwork. He tried to help but quickly got overwhelmed. Again, he suggested I quit my job and focus on fixing things at home. He still didn't understand. My income was no longer optional. It was the only thing keeping us afloat. The next day, Child Services returned. Miss McDaniel came with another investigator. Their inspection was even more thorough this time. They interviewed Clara and Leo separately in their rooms, while Darren and I waited silently in the living room, forbidden from interfering. Leo's interview lasted nearly 40 minutes. We could hear his voice through the door, low, tense, but not what he was saying. Clara's was shorter, but ended with her in tears. The investigators took more photos, more notes. Their faces remained unreadable. After they left, the kids were quiet, jittery. Clara whispered that they'd asked her if she felt safe at home, if anyone ever hurt her. Leo said they wanted to know who made meals, who helped with homework, and why he'd been missing school. Routine questions, but under these circumstances, they felt like violations. Then my phone rang again. Another work emergency. A major client, one of our biggest, was threatening to pull their account because of the failed board presentation. My team needed me immediately. But Darren had a mandatory HR meeting about his performance. Someone had to be home with the kids. I called the only person I had left to turn to, my mother. She lived 3 hours away, but she dropped everything and hit the road. While I waited for her to arrive, I took calls from work trying to salvage the relationship with the client from a distance. Darren came home from his meeting looking like a ghost. He'd been put on a performance improvement plan. One more misstep and he'd be fired. The same man who once mocked my contributions, who reduced my work to choosing between paper or plastic, was now at risk of losing the job he'd built his identity around. When my mother arrived, she stepped into the chaos like a general assessing the battlefield. She took control immediately, sent Darren to the grocery store with a meticulous list, sat down with Leo and walked him through his homework, let Clara vent about her school troubles over tea. I fled to the office where my team was scrambling to prepare for the emergency meeting with the client. We had 2 hours to pull together a presentation to save a $1 million account. Power outage during a child services visit? Yeah, nothing says stable household like interviews conducted by candlelight while your fridge morphs into a science experiment. My assistant had prepared the framework, but the strategy needed my direction. The meeting was brutal. The client questioned every projection, poked holes in every timeline. They referenced the chaotic board presentation, clearly doubting whether we could still deliver. I fought for every slide, drawing on years of expertise to rebuild their confidence in real time. We saved the account barely, But the victory felt hollow when I glanced at my phone and saw multiple missed calls from home. Darren had forgotten, again, to pick up his mother's prescriptions. The pharmacy was closed. She needed her medication tonight. I called every pharmacy in town until I found a 24-hour location that could fill an emergency order. Then I raced across town to pick it up, adding another crisis to my already unbearable to-do list. The bare minimum had become a crushing weight. When I got home, my mother had worked miracles. The house was cleaner, the kids were calm, dinner was on the table. But she pulled me aside, quietly concerned. Darren, she said, couldn't follow even the simplest instructions. He'd bought the wrong groceries, forgotten half the items, and blew the budget on overpriced, prepackaged food. That night, she offered to stay for another week to help. I wanted to decline, to prove I could handle it on my own. But the reality was unavoidable. We needed help. Darren's incompetence had spiraled into a crisis that was actively unraveling our lives. The next morning, more complications. The school called. Clara had been marked absent from 3 classes. Despite being dropped off, she'd spent the morning hiding in a bathroom stall, too anxious to face her peers. I left another critical meeting at work to address it. The school counselor recommended immediate therapy. The principal gently suggested Clara might benefit from their alternative program for students in crisis. My straight A daughter was now being categorized as troubled. Meanwhile, Darren texted that Child Services had called again. This time they wanted to schedule a family assessment. A psychologist would evaluate our family's dynamics. The investigation had expanded beyond home checks. It was now about emotional health and parenting fitness. I sat in the school parking lot making calls, arranging therapy, contacting the lawyer, rescheduling client meetings. Every call felt like an admission of failure. The life I had so carefully built was collapsing because Darren couldn't manage the very tasks he once mocked. That afternoon, my boss texted asking if I'd be available for a major conference next week. It was a key opportunity, a chance to network, land new partners, and lock in my position long term. But it meant being away from home for 3 days, in the middle of the investigation. That evening, I came home to find Darren trying to help Leo with his math homework, but he was teaching it completely wrong, and Leo grew more confused by the minute. When I gently stepped in to clarify, Darren exploded, accusing me of undermining him in front of the kids. Leo fled to his room in tears. My mother stepped in, calmly diffusing the situation. She sent Darren away to cool off and stayed to comfort Leo. Later, she pulled me aside and said she was concerned, not just about Darren's behavior, but about his state of mind. She said he seemed desperate, fragile, that he might need professional help himself. The family assessment was set for Friday. We spent the week trying to prepare, rehearsing answers, trying to present a united front, but every day revealed more cracks. Darren couldn't remember basic facts, what classes the kids were in, their teachers' names, their closest friends. He fumbled through conversations like a stranger trying to play the part of involved dad. On the morning of the assessment, Clara refused to leave her room. She had developed stress hives and was scratching until she bled. Leo had wet the bed for the first time in years. The pressure was destroying them. The psychologist, Dr. O'Daniel, arrived exactly on time. She observed how we interacted as a family, asked sharp questions, took meticulous notes. Darren tried too hard, stumbling over his words, making basic errors she definitely picked up on. I could hear his nervous laughter echoing through the house during his one-on-one interview. He was overcompensating and likely making things worse. The kids were quiet, withdrawn. Their answers were clipped and wary. The whole session felt like watching our lives dissected under a microscope, every flaw magnified by clinical detachment. Dr. O'Daniel left with a neutral farewell and said she'd submit her report within a week. Her face gave nothing away,
but at one point I caught her looking at Darren, not with suspicion exactly, but with something closer to concern or pity. I wasn't sure which was worse. That weekend, my mother returned home. She'd done all she could. She hugged me tightly and told me something had to change. She'd seen enough to worry, not just about the present, but about the future if things kept going like this. Then Monday arrived and brought an email that made my stomach drop. The school board had voted. Clara could remain enrolled, but she was banned from all extracurriculars until the investigation concluded. No volleyball, no clubs, no normalcy. I watched her read the email, watched her face change, watched something inside her fracture. Clara had worked so hard to earn her spot on the volleyball team, and now it was gone because her father couldn't keep track of a prescription bag. The unfairness of it was crushing. Darren's response? He blamed the school, the system, the other parents, everyone but himself. He ranted about discrimination and unfair treatment while I quietly made phone calls trying to appeal the school's decision. But I knew it was pointless. Our reputation had taken too severe a hit. My work began to suffer as I juggled crisis after crisis. Projects fell behind, meetings were pushed, my team did their best to cover for me, but my absence was noticeable. The promotion I had fought so hard to earn was slipping away, replaced by quiet conversations and sympathetic glances about my complicated situation at home. Then came the letter from Child Services. The investigation was moving into the next phase. Both parents were now required to undergo psychological evaluations, complete parenting classes, and agree to regular follow-ups. Non-compliance would trigger formal proceedings. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter in disbelief. How had we gotten here? From Darren belittling my work, saying it was so easy a Roomba could do it, to him nearly destroying our entire family through sheer incompetence. The man who mocked household responsibilities now couldn't even perform them safely. That night, I made a decision. I called our lawyer and asked about initiating a separation. Not divorce, not yet. But something needed to change. Darren's inability to function as a responsible adult was dragging us all under, and I couldn't give the kids the stability they needed while also managing his failures. The lawyer was careful. With an open child services investigation, any drastic changes could be viewed as destabilizing. Separation might be seen as a red flag. We were trapped, locked in a broken dynamic we weren't allowed to leave, at risk of making things worse by trying to fix them. I found Darren in the garage, fumbling with tools he'd never used, trying to bring some order to chaos he barely understood. He looked up as I stepped inside, and for a brief moment, I saw the version of him I'd married, before the arrogance and the denial had worn thin. We talked for hours that night, not fighting, just talking. About where we'd gone wrong, about what needed to change, about whether our marriage could survive the aftermath of his long-standing belief that the things I did didn't matter. And for the first time, Darren admitted the truth. He'd never learned how to run a home. His mother had done everything, then I had. He'd coasted through life believing household management was simple because someone else always handled it. Now, forced to face reality, he was drowning. But confession wasn't a solution. The investigation continued. The damage to our children deepened. My job still hung by a thread. Darren's newfound awareness didn't suddenly give him the skills he lacked. We were still in the middle of a slow-moving collapse, just slightly more self-aware about it. The next morning brought yet another crisis. Leo's teacher called. He'd read a disturbing essay about home life. Nothing abusive, but troubling enough to warrant another report to Child Services. Another black mark. I sat in my car, numb after the call, wondering if there was any way out of this spiral. Every attempt to solve one problem seemed to expose two more. Darren's initial failure had triggered an avalanche that buried us all. The bare minimum had turned into an unreachable mountain. As I drove, late again to work, I thought about the brutal irony. All those years Darren spent dismissing my work, dismissing me, and now his inability to replicate it was unraveling everything. The truth was bitter and plain. Darren hadn't just failed to manage the bare minimum, he had failed us in ways that might never fully be repaired. And I was left again, holding the shattered pieces of our life together while he floundered, still struggling with tasks he once ridiculed. Tomorrow, the psychological evaluations would come in. And with them, the next wave of consequences. Child services recommendations, more meetings, more attempts to hold together the family Darren's incompetence had splintered. The bare minimum had never felt so impossibly out of reach. 3 days later, the evaluation results arrived in a thick envelope. My hands trembled as I opened it. Darren hovered nearby, wringing his hands, visibly anxious. Dr. O'Daniel's report was long and devastating. She noted Darren's inability to recall basic facts about his children's lives, his defensiveness during simple questions, and, most damning, his ongoing lack of comprehension when it came to household management, despite having months to demonstrate growth. My evaluation told a different story. Dr. O'Daniel had noted my strong organizational skills, my deep understanding of the children's needs, and my ability to maintain structure in the middle of crisis. But she also raised concerns about my stress levels and how unsustainable it was to keep managing everything alone. The recommendation was clear. Darren would need to complete intensive parenting classes. Our family would undergo continued monitoring, and we'd be required to participate in family therapy. Darren snatched the papers from my hands, scanning them like his life depended on what they said. His face turned from ghostly pale to burning red as he read. He crumpled the pages in frustration, then smoothed them out again, like changing their shape might somehow rewrite the contents. I watched him pace the kitchen, muttering about biased evaluations and unfair judgments, refusing to accept what was laid out plainly. The next morning, I woke to find Darren already dressed in his best suit. He'd made breakfast, burnt eggs, and limp toast, but the effort, at least, was there. He told me he was taking the day off to handle everything, that I should go to work and not worry. There was determination in his voice, enough to make me want to believe him. At the office, I tried to focus on partnership proposals, contracts that could solidify my position after the client crisis. My team had worked late prepping materials, but my attention shattered when Clara's school called. She'd had a panic attack during PE. When I arrived, she was curled up in the nurse's chair, her breathing shallow and fast. The nurse explained that some girls had cornered her in the locker room, chanting about her criminal family, mocking her over the prescription incident. Clara had collapsed, hyperventilating. The principal appeared with that same gentle but firm expression she always wore during difficult conversations. She urged me again to consider the school's alternative program, their Fresh Start initiative for students under emotional strain. My daughter, who had once been at the top of her class, now being referred to a program meant for kids in crisis. I drove her home in silence. She stared blankly out the window, wiping away tears with the sleeve of her hoodie. At a red light, she spoke, her voice cracked and quiet. "Can we move somewhere new? Start over where nobody knows?" My heart broke. At home, I opened the door to chaos. Darren had attempted to clean, but he'd mixed cleaning agents and created toxic fumes. The windows were open, fans were running. Leo was sitting on the porch with his homework, which was now being scattered by the wind. Darren emerged from the bathroom coughing, his eyes watery. He also tried to do laundry and managed to mix colors and whites, shrinking Leo's school uniforms in the process. The kitchen showed signs of another failure. A grease fire had left scorch marks on the ceiling. Darren had given up and ordered pizza. The empty boxes were still stacked on the counter. As I stood surveying the damage, my phone rang. It was my mother. She'd heard from Darren's mother about the evaluation results. The two grandmothers had been talking, comparing notes. She offered to move in temporarily to help keep the household stable during the investigation. I wanted to say yes. I needed to say yes, but I also knew that accepting would look like we couldn't manage on our own, something that might not sit well with child services. That evening, Darren proudly announced that he'd signed up for the mandatory parenting classes, 3 evenings a week and Saturdays. He showed me the schedule, beaming with misplaced pride, completely unaware it conflicted with Leo's basketball games and Clara's therapy sessions. I spent hours reshuffling calendars, arranging carpools, negotiating with my boss for more flexibility. Every adjustment felt like a career setback I could feel, a slipping grip on the life I'd spent years rebuilding. The conference next week still loomed, but attending it felt impossible now. After dinner, the doorbell rang. Our elderly neighbor stood there with a casserole in one hand and concern on her face. She'd noticed the police visits, the social workers, the weariness on the kids' faces. She offered help, said she'd raised 5 kids herself and knew how overwhelming it could get. Her kindness broke something in me. I took the casserole with trembling hands, barely holding back tears. She patted my arm and whispered that she'd seen Darren struggling, that the whole neighborhood had. I cried in the bathroom after she left. Darren found me there and tried to comfort me, but his touch felt empty. He promised things would improve once he finished the classes, once he learned the systems. But we both knew it went deeper than logistics. This wasn't about schedules. It was about damage and consequences. The next day brought his first parenting class. I drove him there, watching as he trudged into the building alongside other parents who, in one way or another, had failed their children. The instructor greeted the group with bright professionalism, but the gravity in the room was unmistakable.
While Darren was at parenting class, I took the kids out for ice cream. Leo barely touched his sundae before finally admitting that kids at school were avoiding him. Some parents had told their children not to associate with our family. He'd been eating lunch alone for weeks. Clara added that her old friends had created a group chat specifically to exclude her. She showed me screenshots, cruel messages circulating like wildfire. One called Darren a drug dealer. Another said she probably used drugs too. Teenage cruelty amplified by parental fear. I dropped the kids at home and drove to pick Darren up. He walked out of class looking stunned, shell-shocked. The instructor had covered the basics of child development, and Darren had come to the painful realization that he barely understood his own children's needs. Listening to the other parents share their failures, he recognized himself in every story. On the ride home, he tried to process what he'd learned. They had discussed things like emotional availability, consistent routines, active engagement, all concepts I'd lived and breathed for years. But to him, they were revelations. He pulled out a workbook filled with exercises on understanding a child's perspective. That weekend, child services came again. Miss McDaniel noted improvements in the physical condition of the house, but remained concerned about the family's emotional well-being. She interviewed the kids again. Their responses still reflected stress, anxiety, and instability, despite our efforts. She pulled me aside afterward, more candid than usual. The investigation would remain open for at least 3 more months. Any negative reports could escalate things to formal intervention. She strongly advised me to document everything, especially Darren's participation in the required programs. I spent Sunday compiling detailed logs. Darren tried putting his classwork into action, chatting with Leo about basketball, though his enthusiasm felt forced and awkward. He attempted to help Clara with homework, but quickly got frustrated with the material. Then Monday hit me with a blow I didn't expect. The conference, the one I'd been preparing for, the one that could save my job and our financial stability, had been moved up. I'd have to leave tomorrow for 3 days. Missing it would tank my advancement opportunities. But leaving in the middle of a child services investigation, it felt like abandonment. I called my mother, then Darren's mother. Both could help, but each expressed concern about Darren's ability to coordinate. Even basics like school pickup times and medication schedules were difficult for him to communicate clearly. That night, I worked late creating detailed schedules, emergency contacts, meal plans, color-coded and posted on every wall. Darren watched me in silence, promising he could handle 3 days.
His words were confident, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. The kids' reactions were mixed. Leo asked quietly if Dad would remember basketball practice. Clara asked if Grandma could just take care of everything instead. Neither trusted Darren to keep things under control, and I couldn't blame them. But I had to go. The conference was too important. Without my job, everything would fall apart. I booked the flight, coordinated with both grandmothers, prepped the house for 3 days without me. The morning of my departure, I left before sunrise. Darren was already up, flipping through my printed schedules with a highlighter. He'd set alarms, laid out outfits, prepped ingredients for breakfast. The effort was sincere, even if I wasn't convinced the execution would hold. At the airport, I fielded nervous texts from Darren. Where was the lunch money? What about the permission slip? Which day was Clara's therapy again? Each question was a reminder of how little he truly absorbed, even after months of catastrophe. Still, I answered patiently as I boarded the plane, knowing I wouldn't be reachable for the next few hours. The conference kicked off with networking sessions I'd anticipated for months. Industry leaders discussed partnerships that could change our company's future. I smiled, nodded, asked smart questions, presenting the polished, capable professional they expected, all while juggling the chaos unfolding back home. Between sessions, I checked my phone. 16 missed calls. Texts from both grandmothers, confused and frustrated about the day's schedules. A voicemail from the school. Leo had arrived late. Another from Clara, sobbing because she'd missed her therapy appointment. I excused myself from a high-stakes dinner meeting to deal with the latest meltdown. Darren had confused the pickup schedule and sent both grandmothers to get the kids. They'd argued in the school parking lot, while Clara and Leo waited nearby, mortified.
The second day brought worse news. Darren had forgotten to give Clara her anxiety medication. She suffered another panic attack at school. The counselor was now recommending immediate psychiatric evaluation. Child Services had already been notified, this time for medical neglect. I sat in my hotel room, paralyzed with guilt and indecision. Flying home meant abandoning the final day of the conference, ending my chances at career advancement. Staying meant risking further escalation from Child Services. I called our lawyer. He advised documenting everything, keeping a paper trail, but warned me not to abandon my professional obligations unless absolutely necessary. "You're their stability," he said. "The system will notice that." The final day of the conference featured my presentation on strategic partnerships. I delivered it flawlessly, composed, persuasive, efficient. My voice didn't waver, my slides were polished, and senior leadership nodded throughout. All while my phone buzzed relentlessly in my pocket, each vibration another crack in the life I'd left behind. On the flight home, I stared out the window, numb. I'd secured 2 major partnerships. Senior leadership was impressed. My future at the company was brighter than ever, and yet all I felt was dread. Darren's last text read, "We need to talk. Made things worse. So sorry." When I got home, the house was steeped in quiet disarray. Clara had locked herself in her room. Leo sat on the living room floor playing video games, surrounded by empty food containers. Darren was at the kitchen table, eyes sunken, with a stack of official-looking documents in front of him. Child Services had issued an emergency order. The missed medication, combined with prior concerns, had triggered heightened monitoring. Daily check-ins, a mandatory psychiatric evaluation for Clara, increased parenting requirements for Darren. The grandmothers had written detailed logs of the 3-day meltdown, missed meals, forgotten school pickups, abandoned homework. They had practically moved in to prevent total collapse. Meanwhile, Darren had turned the house into a kind of domestic war zone. His failed cleaning experiments led to toxic fumes. He thought mixing bleach and vinegar meant extra strength. He learned otherwise the hard way. Those 2 grandmothers had coordinated like covert operatives. Their combined intel read like a spy dossier, chronicling every near disaster Darren had created in my absence. That night, I triaged the wreckage. I scheduled Clara psychiatric appointments, responded to Child Services requests, and spent hours comforting 2 emotionally wrecked kids. Darren sat nearby,
silent and hunched, occasionally whispering apologies for missed medication, for forgotten lunches, for being so far behind where he needed to be. The next morning, I returned to the office. The partnerships had been approved, my compensation was increased, leadership was thrilled. I should have felt triumphant, and yet all felt dread. The dissonance was staggering. Professional success achieved while my personal life sat in splinters. My boss congratulated me with warmth, but followed it with a quiet comment about how exhausted I looked. Clara's evaluation confirmed what I feared. She was suffering from severe anxiety. The psychiatrist prescribed daily medication, intensive therapy, and a treatment plan that would take months to stabilize her mental health. That same week, Darren began the advanced parenting course. After the first class, the instructor pulled me aside. She gently told me that Darren was struggling, that he seemed disconnected from basic parenting concepts, that his understanding of responsibility and emotional engagement was still alarmingly low. She recommended individual counseling to address the deeper roots of his incompetence. Out of necessity, we built new routines. The grandmothers rotated care days. I adjusted my work schedule around therapy appointments. Darren operated on rigid checklists, step-by-step instructions for every task. The kids moved through the week like tired ghosts. Then, unexpectedly, something shifted. Darren walked in on Leo crying over a school project, an assignment about family heroes. Leo had started writing about me, but it crossed it out, ashamed of how our family looked to others. He'd begun rewriting the project about a fictional character instead. That night, something in Darren cracked open. He sat with Leo for hours, helping him rewrite the project, but more importantly, talking. Acknowledging the ways his own failures had hurt this family. Admitting his blind spots. Owning the impact, not just the intent. Later that week, the parenting class covered emotional intelligence. Darren came home with new insight. That his dismissiveness, his mocking attitude, stemmed from his own insecurity. He had feared being seen as inadequate, so instead he belittled the work he couldn't do. He was finally starting to see. The instructor assigned exercises in validation and appreciation, and for once, Darren approached them with humility. No frantic gestures, no hollow promises, just slow, deliberate change. He focused on mastering one task at a time. Breakfast became his territory, done right, every day. Then school lunches, small wins, but real ones. During the next Child Services check-in, Miss McDaniel noted the progress. She observed Darren manage the morning routine while I prepped for work. She watched his interactions with the kids, less performative now, more grounded. She took notes, but also gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. Real improvement, documented.
The psychiatric support helped Clara slowly return to her regular classes. Her anxiety didn't vanish, but it became manageable. She started sitting with one kind classmate during lunch, whose mother had reached out to me privately, defying community whispers and judgment. Leo's teacher reported noticeable improvements in his focus. The fragile but growing stability at home allowed him to concentrate again. He made the basketball team, and Darren went to every practice, learning the sport alongside him, no longer just present, but engaged. My work finally stabilized. Home life became predictable. The partnerships I'd secured began delivering measurable results. My boss acknowledged my commitment and perseverance. For the first time, the promotion I'd earned felt secure, mine without condition or caveat. Darren's graduation from his basic parenting course was almost anticlimactic. The certificate he received felt trivial compared to the transformation he'd undergone. But the lessons had stuck. He no longer dismissed what I had carried on my shoulders invisibly for years. After 6 long months, the Child Services investigation officially closed. Ms. McDaniel's final report noted significant improvement and demonstrated stability. She commended our commitment to change while acknowledging the depth of the challenges we had faced and were still working through. That evening, we had dinner together as a family. No crisis, no chaos. Darren cooked. Nothing extravagant, pasta and roasted vegetables, but it was warm, nutritious, and intentional. The kids shared their days freely. There was no tension, No micromanaging, just normal. Later, Darren found me paying bills, a task he'd never noticed before. He sat beside me and asked to learn the system I'd created, not because I asked him to, not because someone else told him to, but because, finally, he understood why it mattered. I showed him the spreadsheets, the recurring payments, the monthly budget that kept everything afloat. He apologized, again, but this time it was different. Not panicked, not performative. It was genuine. A quiet, humbled recognition of all the things he had once dismissed. He saw now that what he used to call the bare minimum was in fact the foundation that held our lives together. We weren't fully healed. Trust still wobbled. The kids still watched him with some caution. I still carried most of the mental load. But Darren contributed now, not as a favor, not in bursts of panic, but deliberately, consistently. He had learned, finally, that competence wasn't innate. It was built, learned, practiced, earned. The following year, Clara made the volleyball team, again. Darren drove her to every practice. He studied the game's rules so he could cheer for her properly. Leo flourished in school, with both parents truly present this time. The family still wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it worked. I kept my promotion, built on those partnerships. My career thrived because I finally had true support at home. Darren never again questioned the value of my work. He no longer suggested it was less than his. He had learned the hard way, what I had always known deep down. The bare minimum wasn't minimal at all. It was the invisible infrastructure of life itself. And finally, after near total collapse, our family understood that truth. We moved forward, scarred but wiser, slowly rebuilding something sustainable out of the rubble of Darren's painful but necessary lesson. That it took a full breakdown for him to recognize the magic in clean socks and packed lunches. It might be funny if it weren't so heartbreakingly real. Thanks for reading. See you in the next one.